the dietary guidelines have never been assessed for efficacy. We've never looked back and said, hey, how did we do? It's another standard in science. Are we actually getting the outcomes that we envisioned? They found that 95% of the committee had conflicts of interest with food and or pharmaceutical companies. A healthy person is not a good customer, and a dead person is not a customer. It's right in the middle. It's sickness. That this industry is built on sickness. That if you control oil, you can control nations. But if you control food, you control people.
Hey, everybody. Welcome to the Sovereign Health Podcast. My name is Andy Schoonover, and we're on a mission to inspire radical personal responsibility for both the financial and physical aspects of your health. We get the joy of hosting thought leaders who are reimagining how healthcare is delivered. Today, we have Jay Gulinello. He's a nutritionist, thought leader, health coach, and an expert in the biochemistry of the foods we eat. He has a master's in nutrition. We're excited to have him on the pod. Jay, good to have you on the pod. Thanks for coming.
Oh, man, thank you so much for having me. It's nice to see you again, and pleasure to be here.
Yeah, so we met originally at the Meat Mafia event down in Nashville, and I remember sitting in the audience listening to what you had to say and was just blown away by a number of the stories that you told. And one of the things that I really kind of struggle with when I talk about food and how it impacts our bodies and some of the origin stories of some of these organizations that have kind of dictated what we eat today is ultimately, sure. It's easy to jump to conspiracy theory, right? Like, this is just crazy. There's no way that these industries could be putting this stuff into our bodies. There's no way that the government, who's supposed to care for us, allows this to happen. And I sit here and I listen to you and I'm like, holy crap. There are industries, there are players that in the way that some of this stuff has been created that aren't there for our best interests, and I think the one story that like blew me away is this food pyramid. Like the origin story of the food pyramid has just blown me away. And so if you would, would you be willing to share what you shared at the Meat Mafia podcast about how this thing that has dictated pretty much what we put in our bodies for the last, 30 or 40 years, and how that came to be?
It's a soap opera. Truly, and it's funny because I've spent the better part of a decade now in school formally studying nutrition and biochemistry and all these things, and nowhere in all of this amazing information that I feel lucky to have attained, nowhere did the history, or as you said, how we got here. And I think that as a nutritionist, I feel like you do need to have an appreciation for that, because it alleviates the sort of theme of just regurgitating advice that you've heard before, right? Everybody knows you should eat, everybody knows saturated fat is bad. Everybody knows this. But when you actually then just ask the simple question, why or how, how do we get here? That's when the things begin to unfold. And you can go back to the 1800s if you really want to go back. But I, generally speaking, I go back to the McGovern Senate Committee on Nutrition and Human Needs. And what's interesting about that organization is that committee was actually designed to address malnutrition in the United States. But by the time they got going in the 70s, malnutrition had essentially been eliminated. And now we were sort of swimming in calories. It's debatable how nutritious the foods were even in the 70s, but malnutrition was not the issue. And so I have a couple of just quotes that I didn't even share at that event, because I'm telling you, this can go in so many different directions. But I think it's really telling when you start to think about some of the things that were going through these people's minds as they were developing this sort of set of dietary guidelines, which inevitably was published in 1977. So this committee, Marshall Matz and Alan Stone, they were general counsel and staff director of the committee. And they said that, quote, this was just a casual endeavor, and that we were really totally naive, a bunch of kids who just thought, hell, we should say something on the subject of nutrition before we go out of business. Because again, malnutrition had essentially been eliminated at that point. And so
Wow.
McGovern and all of his fellow senators were a bunch of middle-aged guys who generally speaking had growing waistlines and were concerned about their health. And so they allowed this process to go forward, which is just sort of shocking all by itself. And then just some more quotes like, let's see, the question to be asked is not why should we change our diet, but why not? This was Mark Hegstead, one of the authors of the actual guidelines. He said there are no risks that can be identified and important benefits that can be expected. These are not scientific terms. These are not, this is just a bunch of people looking to go down in history for something. And I know it's hard to believe that the people we put in position, we elect and we put them in positions of authority, we hope that they have our best interest. But the truth is we're all human and we're all susceptible to a set of biases, a set of egos. And so it seems to a large degree that in the summer of 1976, when these guidelines were being debated for a whole 2 days, 2 whole days, the history of nutrition was debated for essentially 48 hours. And the controversy continued into the 70s and 80s and until the sort of food pyramid was put in solid form. And I can tell you a little bit more about that. But these guidelines, the dietary guidelines for Americans that were drafted in 1977, this is how they came to be. They came to be from a committee who was on its way out, and they just wanted to leave their mark on history. And I would say mission accomplished, because they certainly did that.
Wow. And now we have almost 10% of the population that has diabetes, or, vastly obese, overweight, in any metric that you look at, it has not been good. And so just kind of going back, the initial reason why these folks got together, it sounds like none of them were scientists. Or very few of them were scientists giving input into this. No, very few of them were nutritionists. I don't even know if nutritionist was a thing back in the 70s. So it was politicians who wanted to have a purpose, who originally went in thinking, oh, we're going to figure out malnutrition. Oh, whoops, that's not an issue anymore. So let's figure out some other purpose for that so that we can actually all have purposes in life, right? And so let's put together something that we have know nothing about that will impact the next 50 years of our history that we decided in 48 hours. I mean, that sounds totally crazy to me.
It does. And but what's amazing is that it's not really crazy when you look at history. Government organizations and committees, once they are created, they tend not to go away, right? Once we create bureaucracies, they don't ever say, you know what, we've done our job, we will voluntarily go the way of the dodo bird. It doesn't really usually work like that, and they need to justify their existence. And so this is kind of what happened. And actually, to your point, I think the World Obesity Federation actually projects that 51% of the world's population, which will be more than 4 billion people, will be considered overweight or obese in 12 years by 2035. And that actually 49.3% of the US population has prediabetes or diabetes, and then an additional 23% are undiagnosed.
Wow.
So when they say, what could go wrong? Why shouldn't we change our diet? There's literally no risk and only upside. Well, again, that is not true. And while correlation is not causation, in my opinion, and I know that I'm biased from a nutritional perspective, this is one of the highest yield inputs we have into the human body, into the human system, is nutrition, is food. We take milligram quantities of a pharmaceutical, and it can have dramatic effects. We eat milligram quantities of food on a daily basis for decades. And to think or to pretend that this would not have a dramatic impact on health is naive, to say the least. So I would say that we should now examine. And well, that's the other thing, is that the dietary guidelines have never been assessed for efficacy. We've never looked back and said, hey, how did we do? It's another standard in science. Are we actually getting the outcomes that we envisioned? No, we're actually getting the opposite. And yet we still continue to double down on these guidelines. So just sharing some of those statistics, think about that. Half of the world by 2035 is going to be obese. That's a serious financial problem. It's a serious problem, just again, as a society at large, who's going to care for these people. So we have to look at the dietary guidelines and just assess blame there. I'm not saying that's the only factor, but it certainly shares part of the blame.
Yeah, so the McGovern Commission clearly dictated which way the United States was going to go in terms of our dietary guidelines, dietary regulations. Ultimately, was it the 1980s that the food pyramids came into existence, or was it before then?
Yeah, it was. Yeah, the 80s were when it was being debated by a set of nutritionists. Louise Light was sort of the head of that group of
Hmm.
nutritionists, and they actually did quite a thorough job. And I believe 92 was when it was officially put out in that
Okay.
food pyramid that everybody knows. But in the 80s is when the actual data was being so the guidelines were just the draft of the committee, and they weren't
Hmm.
really that was essentially all they were. But then these nutritionists got together and actually drafted this pyramid that we all know and love so much. And even Louise Light says that the pyramid that she designed with her professionals, it was not the pyramid that was handed over. She has some amazing quotes about what did she say? She said, when our version of the food guide came back to us revised, we were shocked to find that it was vastly different from the one that we had developed. And as I later discovered, this is Louise Light speaking, as I later discovered, the wholesale changes made to the guide put in by the Office of the Secretary of Agriculture were calculated to win the acceptance of the food industry. And she said that in the end, maybe perhaps many Americans actually did follow the food pyramid, and that is why they ended up overweight. So she even says
Wow.
she predicted an obesity and a type 2 diabetes epidemic in the 80s, in the early 90s, when she saw that the food pyramid was not what the science the science that her and her group had put together. It was actually essentially changed around for industry purposes, and she predicted this current crisis that we're facing. And it's really hard, to say I'm happy to be proven right. I'm sure she feels the same way. Nobody wants to be proven
Right.
right when we bring these things up, but the evidence is there.
Is there any documentation around how the food industry specifically influenced that food pyramid? I know that the woman you just mentioned, said that there was some interaction there, but is there any, kind of concrete documentation that, the Department of Agriculture engaged some of these food organizations to dictate, what this food
Yeah,
pyramid would look like?
it's a good question, and the problem is there is evidence, but it's all over the place, and it's really hard to centralize it. I think that a lot of it actually exists in her book, and in a book written by Denise Minger called "Death by Food Pyramid." So for your audience, those are Death by Food Pyramid is an absolutely
That's
fantastic
a good
read.
good title. Wow,
It's a
Death
great
by Food
title, right?
Pyramid.
And Minger's a really entertaining writer, and for someone who was in grad school for and studying formally, I actually still found time to read this book. It was not part of my curriculum. I just found time to read the book, but it was such a quick read. So I highly recommend that. And that has a lot of citations. You'll find a lot of those notes. But your point, I think, is well taken, because what we do have though today, if you want to fast forward to today, I would ask, now that that influence has been had on the original committee, how does it stay, right? In other words, why haven't we corrected course over the past 30 years? And the answer is, you can just look back as recently as the 2020 Dietary Guidelines Committee. Now, it's funny, when I was in school, I applied to address the committee in person in Texas. So they people don't know this, but they actually take public comments, and you can be chosen to physically speak for the committee. And I was actually chosen to go down there and speak. And unfortunately, I was working at a hospital in New York City at the time, and I think I was in my second semester in grad school. I just couldn't get down there. It was in the middle of the week. I just couldn't make it happen. And it's a great disappointment of mine that I wasn't able to stand there and actually address the committee. I'm not sure what good it would have done. That's probably a day that those people dread, because, literally the entire public is berating them for an entire day. It's probably not a pleasant experience. So I was trying to think of ways I could actually cut through the noise. I didn't want to yell at them. I wanted to appeal to their sense of duty and all these sort of righteous things. But in the end, I wasn't able to go. But paper was published in 2022 looking at the conflicts of interest with this 2020 dietary guidelines. That's where I'm getting to. And they found that 95% of the committee had conflicts of interest with food and or pharmaceutical companies. And that was published in 2022 in Public Health Nutrition. So 19 of 20 members had conflicts of interest, and the conflicts numbered over 700 conflicts were found. One advisor on the committee alone had over 152 ties to industry, and more than 50% of the committee members were connected to 30 industry actors or more, and that's food and or pharmaceutical companies. So how this has continued through the years, I think that's really easy to see at this point, because we can just look at the conflicts of interest of the actual members of the committee now.
And so just to simplify that statement a little bit, it was when you say conflicts of interest, it is in essence, most of the time, these people are getting paid by organizations that have an interest in influencing what our dietary guidelines are. So, for
Right.
example, there might be a food company that creates lots of food that might be the base of that food pyramid, or grains, cereals, pastas,
Mhm.
things like that, that may be paying some of these scientists, professors, whoever they may be, to be doing studies, or they can mask it in all kinds of different ways, but they're paying these people to, in essence, keep their product as a key component of our dietary intake, even though um, they're harmful to us. I mean,
Right.
that
The
sounds
conflicts of
bonkers. It sounds
it
bonkers to
does.
people who hear that for the first time.
Yeah. No, it does. And I, for your audience listening, I think it's really important to take this slow, because it's like drinking from the fire hose, I say often, when you're starting to uncover these things. And that's what happened to me. What led me to grad school, what led me to invest in my life in this, was this independent research, and kind of thinking, there's no way. There's no way that's true. There's no way that's true. And all of a
Hmm.
sudden, you start crossing things off the list when you can actually pull up the conflicts of interest documentation. And I can show you even one from the 2025 committee, the committee that is currently debating the 2025 dietary guidelines. And they're not just food industry; they're also pharmaceutical industry. And let's just face it, who benefits from sickness more than anybody? The pharmaceutical companies, right? There's a spectrum where a healthy person is not a good customer, and a dead person is not a customer. It's right in the middle. It's sickness. That this industry is built on sickness. And
Hmm.
I'm not anti-pharmaceutical. We need them to some degree, but I do think that they have overgrown their usefulness. And now everything is treated with a pill. It's the pill for an ill model. And we've lost the desire even to address root cause, which again, I think, and there are papers going all the way back to the 80s that talk about nutrition as the cornerstone of prevention, and yet it doesn't seem that we're practicing that way. But if you look at the 2025 committee, so they have these things broken down into multiple categories, the conflicts of interest. And so I just went through all those individual conflicts. So what the 2025 committee did, and I think this is a little sneaky, is they aggregated their conflicts of interest. So I can no longer go in to the USDA and look and see how much this person got from who. I can no longer see that. I can now only see at large the industry actors. So I pulled just from a section called consulting fees. So this is one way, right? So they may not necessarily say, hey, we're going to give you $100,000 to make sure that Lucky Charms are considered a health food. But consulting fees from companies like Eli Lilly or Pfizer or the World Health Organization or Weight Watchers, right? All of these strange actors who don't really have necessarily a lot to do with nutrition. Certainly, Weight Watchers has something to do with nutrition in terms of calorie counting. And then under sections like financial or non-financial, which I thought was funny because isn't that everything? It's
Yeah, I
either
was gonna say.
financial or non-financial. But under that category, we have Beyond Meat. So isn't that interesting?
Hmm.
Right? So the messaging around those fake meat foods, well, now one of the members is getting either a financial or a non-financial benefit from Beyond Meat, but I can't tell who it is because the conflicts have been aggregated. And I think that's because that paper that was published in 2022 really hurt the credibility of the 2020 dietary guidelines when you find out that 19 of 20 are conflicted. So now they aggregate, and everybody was, in the health space was pretty upset about this because I think transparency is key, and apparently the US otherwise.
Yeah, and so why do you think they started aggregating? I mean, if transparency is key,
Mm-hmm.
aggregation clearly makes things a little more foggy in terms
Sure,
of totally understanding this. Again,
sure.
I'm trying to understand ultimately who are the players in the game here, and what are they trying to accomplish? Because clearly, from my perspective, what they're trying to do is the antithesis of human flourishing. And it is, from me, it looks like it's greed, love of money, stock prices, or in some cases, it's a purpose around global warming and, less meat because cows fart. Like it feels like there's maybe a couple buckets in which this falls into, which is I'm looking for a
Yes.
purpose in kind of this global warming, or sorry, climate change. Sorry, I'm not using the right term. Climate change
I
issue,
think I,
or if
I think
it's
now it's global. I think it's global boiling now. I literally heard somebody at the World Health Organization say global boiling. So I don't know
it'll
what the
it'll be
terms
that
are
way
anymore.
until like February when it's cold as hell outside. It's like, is it money? Is it purpose? I mean, what is driving this? That's what I'm trying to kind of understand.
Well, I think, and this is speculation on my part, which I always like to put up front. I a lot of everything I deal with is either biochemistry or factual, and then if it's not, I always say speculative. But what I'm starting to see now is even food companies talk about. I just wrote an article on something called you're not even going to believe this, called meaty corn. Corn that bleeds. Essentially, it's a modified organism that allows corn to carry some of the protein properties of meat. It's the most hideous thing you've ever heard of. But in the and it's from my home state of Massachusetts, the company that's creating it. But in the sort of press release for this Frankenfood, they talk about this food as intellectual property. They actually use the word. I have been now starting to adopt their terminology because I believe that aside from the typical conflicts of interest where we can see things like, as you said, everyone can understand financial conflicts. If somebody was to come to you and say, I'm going to give you $50,000 to tell the world about this product, you're going to think, great. I mean, and even better if I like the product, but I might take the $50,000 even if I don't. And let's face it, in the world of social media and influencers, I know there are people out there promoting things that they don't use. I know
Hmm.
professional athletes don't all drink, their favorite soda that they recommend to everybody. So there is that element, but there's also this more insidious element of intellectual property. And I always go back to Henry Kissinger, who was a former Secretary of State in the United States. And he said that if you control oil, you can control nations, but if you control food, you control people.
Wow.
So intellectual property is incredibly important here. And what I notice as a theme, and think about this, right? So as you start to observe the world around you, the foods that are often, or I would say almost always demonized, are the natural foods, the foods that can roam your backyard or you can grow in your garden, right? And it's always these, and then it's always a push to these foods that can't possibly be grown in your yard or wander your property. It's always these fake meat burgers or these frankenfoods, or these cereals. Like cereals carry the heart healthy label very often. You can't make cereal at home. Cereal comes in a box with a
Yeah.
barcode, and it's intellectual property. So that's the theme. I think there's this push away from natural foods, and if you want to get really into the weeds, I mean, most natural foods are what help give us the most robust health. Red meat is a superfood, it's a health food. We're suffering from an epidemic of low testosterone in men. Well, healthy fats, sunlight exposure, which is something else they tell us not to do,
Yeah.
right? Sunlight exposure, healthy fats, exercise. These are things that will help testosterone and all of these things. So I think there is a concerted effort to move us away from healthy foods and into intellectual property, otherwise known as processed foods.
Wow. It's just an extension of the consumerization of America, in which we have to buy everything. We don't do a lot, by ourselves in the backyard anymore. We don't have vegetable gardens. We don't have cows hanging out back there to give us
Mm-hmm.
milk and meat and things like that. And so it's just incredible to me that special interests have had such an huge impact on the basics of humanity, ultimately in this
Right.
country. I think we at CrowdHealth are trying to reduce prices, but in essence, the real win here is, and I say this over and over again, is if we can have people who are in their 70s, 80s, and 90s out in the backyard throwing frisbee with their grandkids and not
Yeah.
having diabetes or congestive heart failure or COPD or all of these things that we've gotten kind of bamboozled into believing are genetic or whatever, because the
Oh,
vast majority of it is not. It's what we are doing in our, I'm 44, in our 30s, 40s, 50s that are dictating what's going on in our 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s. And just
Hmm.
like, smoking back in the, 50s and 60s, those were fine. Those were cool. Ultimately what we found out now is probably those aren't fine and probably aren't cool and probably aren't healthy for us. And so, but that is a commercialization, consumerization driven by, from my perspective, greed and stock
Yeah.
prices and dollars. I like to listen to people like you who you're not getting compensated to be on my podcast or to tell me, all of these things. Like, you have very little incentive to tell me, all the things that we've been talking about today. And in fact, there's a counter incentive because there are very powerful interests that could have impacts on people who speak out against their interests to have an impact on their lives. Like, so there's a counter incentive here to point out some of the things that are going on in our world, especially in our food system. We have other people speaking out about the monetary system. We have others speaking about, the health system. Like, all of these systems are, kept afloat by these special interests that are making tons of
Sure.
money, just not for our well-being, like not focused on our well-being. They are focused on something else. And so, man, thanks for stepping up and talking about this stuff, because it's hard things to talk about, and a lot of people don't want to hear it.
Right. They don't. I mean, ignorance is bliss, and I understand that in busy lives, and that's why I do what I do. And you're right. I mean, I've turned down multiple opportunities to get paid to even just push a product that is moderately healthy, but because I truly don't believe in the product, I won't do it. I
Hmm.
won't do it. And that's, I'm not looking for praise for that. I understand that we're in the information age, and along with that also comes information overload. And so I try to strip things down to a real simple place. In fact, I was just speaking with a client today who said to me that same thing. She said, "I feel like I have access to so much information, and it paralyzes me." And I said, "Oh, I think it's in some ways almost designed to paralyze you, because then you throw your hands up and you say, 'All right, just tell me what to do. I'll go follow the food plate, the food pyramid, the parallelogram. Give me a shape, I'll follow it. Doesn't really matter,'" you know? And so what I told her this morning was, I like to go back into history. So um, back in 1935, the League of Nations Technical Committee actually put out a list of foods to eat. Now, so this was, 1935. So there are still some special interests, but not nearly as many as we're
Hmm.
saddled with today, right? And so what they did was they looked at the work of E.V. McCollum. He was a brilliant American biochemist, and he was just looking at. He actually was one of the discoverers of vitamin A. So this is, so we're talking, this guy was sort of one of the OGs in terms of nutrition. He was really looking at things for the first time. And he coined this term protective foods. He made a list of protective foods and said we should eat more of these, and that would leave less room for anything else. And let me just give you the list of protective foods, because I think you'll find this enlightening. And I tell people, hey, let's just go back to 1935. Let's eat from the list of protective foods. And I bet you population health dramatically improves. The list goes like this: meat, fish, eggs, milk, leafy vegetables, and fruit. That's it. It's a pretty simple list. And then he goes one step further and says, I want everyone to stay away from foods like milled grains, refined sugars, and foods that are low in vitamin and mineral value, which is essentially everything that we're consuming today, donuts
Hmm.
and pastries and all these things. But if you just look at that list, the meat, fish, eggs, milk, leafy vegetables, and fruit, I challenge anybody to eat from that list for 30 days and tell me that you don't start to notice your clothes fitting differently. Even if you don't have weight to lose, you might just notice your energy levels, your sleep. There will be something you will notice if you just eat from that list for 30 days. So that's my call to action for people. You don't have to believe me. Take 30 days. It's not going to hurt you to try that for 30 days. People can do the Twinkie diet. You can certainly try this for 30 days and see what happens. So in order to cut through the noise, that's one of the things I do. Go back in history to a time where there was significantly less industry influence and see what the recommendations were. And that's what they were, my friend. That's what they
Hmm.
were.
Yeah.
So that's a powerful message, I think, too.
Yet you can go through each one of those on that list, and you can see how most of them have been demonized in one way or another, right?
Sure.
And so
Hmm.
you start at the top on meat, and right now we can't have cows, and there's something crazy over in Europe where they had to, they were like, we're going to slaughter 500,000 cows or something like that to meet some
It's
weird
unbelievable.
climate change craziness. I'm saying, wait, these are the same PETA people, I'm assuming, that will, don't want us to eat meat, yet they're going to slaughter, 500,000 cows and just let them sit. I don't know what it is. It's hundreds of thousands. I don't know exactly the
It
number, but
is.
like, it when do we get to this point where it's like, this is nuts. This is crazy. This doesn't make sense. We're there, right? Please tell me we're there.
We're there. We're totally there. And you know what's even crazier too? I don't have the statistics in front of me, but let me just do this off the top of my head because this is another avenue that I often discuss is the environmental impact of meat. Well, agriculture in general, according to the EPA's own data, only represents 9.4% of greenhouse gases. Now, I'm going to give a huge caveat. I personally I look very dubiously at CO2 being some kind of toxic gas. In fact, I mean, it's vital for plants and greenery to grow on the planet. So let's just, but I'm going to give them that CO2 is the devil gas. Okay, let's just give them that. Still, agriculture only represents 9.4% of greenhouse gases, whereas industry, including the healthcare industry, represents closer to 24%. So by
Hmm.
making people help us, sick, continuing on this path, we're actually contributing more to greenhouse gases than agriculture. But I'll even go one step further. If you break down that 9.4%, only 40% is from animal agriculture. So crops actually contribute more to the greenhouse gas emissions. So you are talking about the lowest of the lowest hanging fruit, which tells me it's not really about solving problem of greenhouse gases. It's about control. So that's just a
Hmm.
side note because I'm pretty sure those numbers were spot on because I do this presentation a lot because people ask me, okay, I believe you about the health impact, but what about the environment? You can't argue the environment. And I've written an entire Substack article just on the environmental impact of meat. It's called Cattle Lives Matter. And it goes through all of those numbers. And it's really yeah,
Wow, I
I
love
get
it.
myself in trouble
I was
sometimes.
gonna say, not shying away from controversy.
I think, my friend, as you said, what point are we at? I think we're at that point where we don't have the luxury of existing in the background anymore and shying away from controversy. We have to attack these things head on because before you know it, the government is going to be telling us we have to kill our cows and we have to do these crazy things that, I mean, I live in New York and they want to start tracking our meat and dairy purchases because of greenhouse gases, which just doesn't make any sense, but it's real. It's a real
Hmm.
thing that's happening in the city that I live in, which is why I'm trying to get out, but also trying to fight for the truth to get out there because I just I think I said this at the event. If you want to eat vegetables your whole life, be a vegan or vegetarian, that's your right. But I also should have the right to be able to eat animals because I believe that is truly the path to health. And I think should be a uniting factor. Unfortunately, lots of vegans and vegetarians think it's a good thing that the governments are trying to control meat intake, and I think that's a very short-sighted view of what's going on here. Because in the end, an unprincipled revolution always eats its own. It will come for you next. In other words, so
Sure. Well, that's the other thing that just struck me during your presentation down in Nashville. I forget exactly what it's called, but there's some organization where all these cities are agreeing to some dietary guidelines that basically will limit our ability to eat meat in any
C40 cities. Yep.
C40 cities. Can you talk about
Mhm.
C40 cities and what is their goal and how does this impact? I live in Austin, Texas. I think it's a C40 city. The one I
Yeah.
looked at it. You live in
Yep.
New York. Is New York a C40 city? So what are
It
people living
is.
in
Yeah.
our cities going to have to deal with if this C40 initiative is successful?
Sure. So there's very, very little literature out there on this, and I think that's probably intentional. So I just decided to pull right off their website. So I'll read to you exactly what they want to do. C40 cities, it's a collection of mayors working together across borders in order to protect people and communities everywhere. Sounds lovely. And build a more sustainable, resilient, and equitable future. To me, these words don't have any meaning anymore. I'm not sure if you're familiar with this term. I learned it recently. It's called semantic satiation, where you repeat words often enough that they actually lose meaning. And so when I hear words like sustainable, resilient, equitable, they start to lose meaning, especially because when you see that they're talking about that their work in this area will help cities to implement solutions that will make it easier for people to eat more plant-based options and waste less food. And doing so will help reduce emissions, improve health. There's no science behind that, and equity, and also, again, the equity word, and then enhance climate resilience around the world. But I just told you that when you're talking about food, you're impacting the lowest hanging fruit of of greenhouse gas emissions, and not only that. So yes, Boston, New York, Chicago, LA, Miami, Houston. I urge people to go to c40cities.org to look and see if their city is on there, because this is worldwide. It's not just the United States. But they're not just focusing on food. So they're also focusing on 6 total sectors: food, construction, clothing, vehicles, aviation, and electronics. So essentially, they want to manage every single aspect of your life, down to the clothes you wear, and then whatever greenhouse gas emissions they produce. So yeah, so this goes back to your question before. People can call it a conspiracy theory, but the fact is, throughout history, humans have conspired. Humans conspire. It's something that we do. And to pretend that we don't is a little naive. I would call that the conspiracy theory. That there's no conspiracy theories. So yeah, that's what C40 cities are. It's there's not a lot of literature out there, but go to their website to see what's going on. And if you're one of those cities, I would say start to perk up your ears and start to listen to what your mayors or your local community is doing, and see if there are places you can intervene. Because I don't want my city intervening in the clothes I'm wearing, the cars I'm driving. Maybe that's why there's a push for smart appliances. Maybe one day my refrigerator won't open because I've reached my carbon allotment for the day. Who knows? I mean, these kinds of things were once unthinkable, but now they're thrown around like they're the perfect solution to our problems.
Yeah, and you said something about the amount of meat that we could eat under this C40 initiative, and it was some crazy stat. I don't remember what it was, but can you remind me how much meat I'm going to be allowed to eat under this C40 initiative?
Yeah, Eat Lancet. That's what they're going by, and I believe I did the math, and it was 1.5 ounces a day. 1.5 ounces of meat per day. Yeah.
And so,
I mean, that's a snack for most people.
what is like a hamburger patty? Like, how many ounces of meat is a hamburger patty? Like, I'm just trying to figure out what is
sure.
1.5 ounces feels like it's less than a hamburger patty.
Sure is. Yeah, I mean, your standard
less.
serving size is 4 ounces is a standard serving size,
okay.
28 grams. So you're talking even less. You're talking a quarter of a patty a day.
That's absolutely nuts.
Yeah.
So I mean,
and to further that, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt, but just to further that, the leading cause of immunodeficiency worldwide is protein malnutrition. So they're taking away one of the most bioavailable forms of protein in the world.
Mm-hmm.
It's amazing.
Yeah.
Amazing.
And so it kind of goes back to my original questions, like, why are people doing this? Like, why? What is the point here? Is it trying to find in a society in which I feel like more and more we have a lack of purpose, and so everybody is looking for a purpose in life. I think we, as just human beings, try to look for a purpose in life as we start taking out some of these things that have been so important historically, and that is family and community and faith and all these things that have given us purpose in life. We start looking at other things like climate change and cows farting and all these kind of crazy things that we latch on to say, I'm going to take this purpose and run with it. I'm going to make this my life purpose. That to me seems at least a part of this. A part of this is what you just mentioned, and I hadn't really kind of thought about it before, and I should have, silly me, but it's control, right? Because in essence, what we have here is a bunch of politicians who just by their nature want to have a certain amount of control and want to gain more control. We just saw this over the last 3 years with COVID. Want to have more and more control over your lives. And as societies, I'm using this word lightly, mature and actually get older, it feels like we're getting more, the politicians takes more and more and more control over the people. We've seen this over and over again as societies, age. We can see this in Europe right now, where Europe is just older than the United States, clearly, and they have gone way farther in controlling their population. That's just almost evolutionary in the way that societies work. And then the third part of this is greed. It's just there's no doubt in my mind that greed plays a role in this. And if you can put all three of those things together and have a narrative based upon, all getting richer by controlling, and having purpose in that, it goes a long way. And it's really, that train is hard to stop, and I feel like it's people like you who have pointed this out. This food thing has become the aggregation of these three kind of components that I think has psyoped us into thinking that grains are good for us, that pasta is good for us, that it is the base layer on this food pyramid that has led to, huge obesity rates. And you earlier you gave the planet-wide averages. I think United States is significantly worse in almost every category than the other OECD countries that have been analyzed. So we're even worse than generic. And so I'm going to get off my rant for a minute, but I think people, when they hear this, and at least my family members, I tell them about this, you're crazy, you're a conspiracy theorist, but I think we have to be careful to not use that as a crutch, just to say, oh, what you're telling me, I don't like to hear, and so I'm just going to call you a conspiracy theorist, without going deeper into some of these very important things, like so important that it's going to dictate whether or not you're going to be able to play football with your grandson when you're 70 or 80 years old. I mean, that is almost the most ultimate importance in somebody's life, is how are they going to be able to live out? How are they going to be able to finish well in their lives? And that's why I get so fired up about this, because I feel like we are getting duped. And people, the media, special interests are calling us conspiracy theories because we're saying some of these things that have been for 50 years told us that they're good for us are actually destroying our bodies.
Boy, you hit on so many great things, and I'm grateful for what you're doing. I mean, the system is broken on multiple fronts, and we need to attack it from multiple fronts, right?
Yeah.
Bottom down, ground up, and in different sectors and in different industries. And I think the term conspiracy theory, that term drives me absolutely crazy. It is designed. It was literally designed to dismantle intellectual thought.
Yeah.
And it works. It works because it allows people to crater into their sort of ignorant bliss, and not have to do any of the hard work. In fact, we see headlines sometimes. The New York Times, Forbes magazine, they have headlines. Every once in a while, you see this headline that says, don't do your own research, leave that to the experts, or something of that sort. And it's really amazing because they are just begging people not to look under the hood. Please, and so again, I often use history as a guide, and then I compare it to what's going on today and say, look, these things are not accidental. So then it's up to you to determine how intentional they are. But very often when a solution isn't simple, like it's not, because it's so multifactorial, because there's influence, some people are just looking out for their own livelihood. Some people are just looking to make a paycheck. Some people have so much money, it doesn't really matter to them. So it's more about control. So, so for everybody, it's a little bit different. But if the end justifies the means, then everyone can get together with this sort of way of, in this approach to life. But that makes it more difficult for us to discern what's at the root of this, or what's driving it. That question you keep asking, what's driving this? And it's not so simple, but you can look all the way back to a book called The Scientific Outlook in 1931 by Bertrand Russell, who was an intellectual of the time. He was like sort of the Bill Gates of the time. And he was saying things like, governments may need to determine population levels and therefore allot certain foods at certain times. And that he even said synthetic beefsteaks is what he called them. Synthetic meat will be served everywhere except at the tables of millionaires. That was in 1931.
Yikes.
So he said, as for meat, it's not necessary for the diet. And if population continues to increase, so what does that sound like? That we may assume that synthetic meat will be served everywhere except at the tables of millionaires. And so that also seems to indicate that they understand that meat is actually an incredibly healthy food, and that it actually helps create a robust population, and that may be not what we want if we're looking to curb the Earth's population, because they come from this Malthusian thinking that the Earth has a certain carrying population,
Mm-hmm.
and if we exceed that population, so now we're getting into like really scary territory. But this stuff is in the medical literature. John Harvey Kellogg, who created Kellogg's, the company
Yeah.
Kellogg's cornflakes, he was an actual eugenicist. That is in the medical literature. I have pulled the paper and read it with my own eyes. He was a eugenicist. That was a very common thing for people in the late 1800s and early 1900s. John D. Rockefeller, who influenced medicine, was a eugenicist.
Wow.
These are facts. These are indisputable facts. So again, it's up to the listener to determine how far they want to go down the rabbit hole. But it doesn't do us any good to look away. Because if it is true, then we're being manipulated on a level that we can't even possibly fathom. And if it isn't, okay, that's fine. Then nothing bad's going to happen. But wouldn't one want to take the precautionary approach and say, I should at least explore this to see if any of these things are legitimate? And I just quoted to you, things that were almost 100 years old. So
Yeah.
this is not by chance. This has been carefully orchestrated on multiple fronts. And it takes us to the food compass of today, which is the sort of latest incarnation of dietary advice. And the food compass comes from a gentleman at Tufts University who is sponsored by the Rockefeller Foundation and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and all of these entities. And what does he tell us? He tells us that Lucky Charms and Honey Nut Cheerios are healthier than butter, meat, and eggs. I mean, it's the height of absurdity, but this is where we are. We have to know what we're up against.
Yeah. I mean, that is, and that Jay was not making a joke there. That was actual truth, where this food compass said Lucky Charms are more nutritious for you than a ribeye. And that is, I mean, again, just I can't even believe how we have gotten here, and it's along these conspiracy theory things. I saw a meme the other day. It said something like, you say conspiracy theory, I say spoiler alert. And it is pretty funny, because as you kind of look back, especially over the last 3 years, if you were to talk to somebody in 2020 about this virus that started in Wuhan, China, where there actually is a coronavirus lab, and for you to say that this may have come from the lab, you would have been looked at like a crazy person, a conspiracy theorist that should be locked away, for your crazy thoughts. And now, here we are, 3 years later. I think a huge chunk, if not the majority of scientists will actually say, you know what, there is a very high likelihood that this actually came from a man-made experiment funded by the U.S. government in Wuhan, China. And that's where people have to look at this and say, okay, the easy thing to say here, and our brains are wired oftentimes to seek the easiest path. We only have so much brain energy. We only have so many, the capability to analyze so many things at once. We are evolutionarily wired to look at the easiest, simplest path. And when something is different than that simplest path, like what Jay is talking about, us, we automatically say, we want to wipe that away. We don't even want to think about it. We want to call it a conspiracy theory. And so what I would ask people who are listening to this is, listen to more of Jay's talks. You go on a lot of podcasts. You're extremely generous with your time, and so we appreciate that. But listen to his talks on, there was 3 other things that I wanted to talk about today that we're not going to get to, but the things that blow me away. Glyphosate is one of the ones. RFK
That's
Jr.
a whole podcast on its own.
It's a whole podcast on its own.
Yeah.
RFK Jr. mentioned it in a Joe Rogan interview fairly recently, I think. And now this is going to be something that lots of people talk about. But in essence, what that is, and Jay, you can correct me if I'm wrong here, but we are spreading toxins on lots of our agricultural things that we eat that are also used to kill bugs, right? Like we are eating bug toxins in essence, right?
Yes.
The things to keep bugs off of your plants, we are ingesting into our bodies. Seed oils, which is a new one that, a lot of people are like, oh, this is just kind of for you weird Twitter people that talk about seed oils. But, seed oils, again, correct me if I'm wrong, were industrial lubricants at one point, right? That have been transitioned to things that we are now eating and could be one of the leading causes of cardiovascular disease in our country because they are so inflammatory to the lining of our hearts. Aspartame, is another one where I think, the World Health Organization or whatever, one of those organizations said is a toxin. Sunscreen, like this is the one that's strange to me now too, where people are saying the things that we're putting in our body via sunscreen is having the ultimate effect, and that we actually shouldn't be using sunscreen. Now, those are just little like bullet point things that you've talked about many of these, if not all of these, on podcasts. Mm-hmm. People, please go and look at these things, do some studies on these things. We will, and maybe Jay will come back and talk to us more about some of these things, because there are things that we're doing to our bodies on a daily basis that society, culture, whatever has been learned behavior that are having significant impacts on our health, and you need to know about them. They're not conspiracy theories. These are rooted in facts from people like Jay who are willing to stand up and saying, this stuff we should not be putting in our bodies. So I've gone on a couple of rants, Jay. So I apologize, but like this stuff blows me away that we're still in this place where we're putting this crap in our bodies, and just then being shocked that cardiovascular disease continues to be, for the last whatever it is, 50, 60, 70 years. I don't know what the number is. The number one killer of people. We shouldn't be shocked by that.
No, and statins, which are the drug to combat cholesterol, which is the supposed driver of heart disease, in 2020 became a $1 trillion industry all by themselves, and yet heart disease still remains the number one killer. But nobody wants to re-examine the paradigm to think maybe the original hypothesis was incorrect. So no, and please, I think these conversations are incredibly important. I would absolutely love to come back and address all of these things, because I've done multiple talks on glyphosate and had whole podcasts on that, and there's a never-ending supply of things to talk about. Their seed oil is the same thing. They're a man-made fat that was designed to replace natural fats, and I think they're contributing not just in inflammatory ways, but they're also reshaping and reshaping our cell membranes, which causes then, because form dictates function in cell membrane structure. So now you've got a compromised cell, and when that happens from the cellular level, you start to become sick. Mm-hmm. And so these things are really important to understand. And yes, for some reason, as we said, they always get dismissed as conspiracy theories. And even people who are educated and should know better than just to dismiss biochemistry, they do that because it is hard to stand up and say, I don't think this is right. There's a great meme out there, that shows, that one person standing in front of a crowd of 1 million, and the speech balloon out of that one person says, yes, you're all wrong, right? It's really hard to say and push back against the tide that no, I don't think this is right. And I'm not saying I have all the answers. What I'm saying is, let's retain our curiosity and put human hubris to the side and allow history and nature to speak louder and see if we can determine what's best for us. I'm not anti-technology. I'm not anti these things. I'm just saying, let's proceed with caution, and let's not always assume that these things are innocent until proven guilty. Let's take the opposite approach when it comes to human health. Any intervention, human or, whether it's a pharmaceutical or a food, they should be guilty until proven innocent. And we don't approach things that way anymore. Again, over the last 3 years, we just threw something into the population, demanded people inject it, and now we're surprised to see professional athletes dropping dead on the field. This is so beyond the pale when it comes to what medicine is supposed to do. They're supposed to protect the population, and instead, it just seems this mad race to be correct instead of a mad race to be right. And so, I would love to talk about all these things. Let's make a note of them. And I write about a lot of these in long form on my Substack. So if people want to go there, that's, I do a lot on Instagram, but Instagram tends to shadow ban me because they don't like what I have to say. But Substack is a great platform for those who don't know, for writers. And I put out a little mini podcast, like 20 minutes of my thoughts once a week. And so that's where you can get a lot of these things. So, feel free to go there and actually read some of the stuff that I've written over the years. Yeah, no, and I appreciate that. And I wanted you to take a little bit of time to tell people where they can find you, because I did not give you the opportunity to go into some of the things that I really respect about you, which is
You get into the biochemistry of this. This is not just a talking head who tells people what to do. I mean, you dive deep into the biochemistry and try to figure out the why of how this stuff is happening and how it's impacting the at a cellular level, our bodies. And so we didn't talk a whole lot about that today, but I want to get people the opportunity to go. And if you're interested, like, Jay goes into the biochemistry of how the seed oils and glyphosate and the food pyramid and all these things really do have a negative impact on our body. So he's way smarter than me on this stuff, and just in general too. But Jay,
I don't know about that, but
thanks. Thank you again for doing this. And Substack is a place they can find you. Where else can we learn more about what you're passionate about?
Sure. Yeah. The two biggest places that I'm the most active are my Instagram page, which is Perpetual Health CO, and then Substack, which is perpetualhealth.substack.com. Those are the two places where I am constantly there, answering comments, responding to messages, citing my sources, putting links in. That's the beauty about Substack, is you can actually put physical links in, so people can actually click them. And yeah, I really appreciate the time and the opportunity to do this, because I feel like being an educator is something that I've become extremely passionate about. I always ask why, and I want to retain that childlike curiosity about things in the world. And so if you're interested in that, I would love to have you aboard. Come follow me, and I will definitely come back. And when we do the glyphosate episode, we won't be able to avoid the biochemistry. There's no way around it. So for all those people who want the biochemistry fix, we'll definitely be able to do that next time.
Yeah, no, I would love that. So glyphosate, seed oils. So there's the two that I read through some of Jay's work that blew me away, because these are things that are in my refrigerator, or were in my refrigerator. And if you're listening to this, they're probably in your refrigerator or cupboard as well. And you're eating this stuff and it's having an impact on your body. So go over to Jay's Instagram, to his Substack, read about this stuff, because you owe it. I'm a parent to two little girls. I feel like I owe it to my girls to make sure that they put stuff in their body that's going to allow them to flourish and thrive, and not be like the majority of Americans who are obese and have chronic conditions by the time that they're 60 or 70. So go in and visit Jay, Instagram, Substack. Jay, thank you again. I really appreciate it. Thanks for what you do. You're clearly you're passionate about teaching. You're skilled at it. So thank you for your willingness to do stuff like this, to continue to educate our listeners and other folks out there as well.
It's absolutely my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks.